Hello, and welcome to another episode of Christian Fiction. This is the series on my channel, Skepticus, where we go through the lies, exaggerations, and half-truths that Christians tell to others, but also that they tell to themselves. The lie that we are diving into today is, you're not a Christian. How many times have you ever heard someone accuse someone else of not being a Christian? Or its close cousin, which is accusing someone of never having been a Christian. How many times have you been that accuser? Now, to be clear, I think that anyone who's ever been part of any group has at some point in their life indulged in exclusionary rhetoric, myself included. So I'm not trying to accuse you of some unspeakable crime. But I do believe that the only thing Christians love more than holding their faith over your head is the simultaneous act of telling scores of other so-called Christians that they are not, in fact, Christians. So it's reasonable for anyone, believers and apostates alike, to ask, just what is a Christian and who gets to make that call? The default that you would usually assume we're going to go to when we talk about matters of faith and Christianity is to go to the Bible, right? What is the biblical perspective on this? But the Bible only uses the word Christian in 3 places. In Acts 11, verse 26, it says, "And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch." So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. In Acts 26, verse 28, it says, "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'You almost persuade me to become a Christian.'" In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 16, it says, "Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner." That's it. Those are all the places that the word Christian is even used in the Bible. Those aren't very helpful for defining Christian, but that's really not surprising. For the bulk of the Bible, being the Old Testament, there was no such thing as a Christian. For a good part of the New Testament, there was still no such thing as a Christian. The Bible doesn't say much about the technical requirements of being a Christian because Christianity grew out of the Bible, specifically the New Testament. Sure, the New Testament does record events that happened after Christianity had already become a codified concept, but that's not all defined there in the book itself. Of course, this doesn't stop Christians from spraining a finger as they page back and forth through the text, extracting verse after tired verse, pointing each one out as their definition of what it means to be a Christian. But there is absolutely no place in the entire book where it says anything even approaching a true definition of the word Christian. So let's step back from the Bible itself for a moment. Let's just look at a lexical perspective. The suffix ian simply means from or related to or like. It can also indicate a specialist or expert in a particular field. It's certainly true that Christians want to be related to Christ, and they especially desire to be like Christ. They would also probably prefer to be seen as experts with regard to Christ, although a scant few of them actually are. So all of this seems to correlate with our ideas of a Christian. However, this is all still incredibly vague for defining really what a Christian is. According to Wikipedia, a Christian is a person who follows or adheres to Christianity. Duh. According to Merriam-Webster, a Christian is one who professes belief in the teachings of Christ. Now, that gets us a little closer, right? And despite what many Christians want to believe, that's actually about as close as we can ever get to a definition without abandoning our intellectual integrity and exposing our own personal dogmas. Now, if you want to know what I mean by that, let's dive back into what would be the Christian perspective. I know that sounds circular. What is the Christian perspective on what it means to be a Christian? But unfortunately, sometimes you need to go back to the Christians themselves to try to get a feel for what this actually means. Of course, Christians won't be happy with the lexical definition of at all. The idea that it's just someone who professes belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. That's not going to make most Christians happy. Anyone can profess belief in the teachings of Jesus Christ. And if anyone can do it, then that strips other Christians of the ability to exclude you. And no Christian would ever want to be stripped of the glorious feeling that they get when they can single-handedly denounce someone else as not being a Christian. So they come up with a series of litmus tests, all of which are tied to various passages and doctrines to determine whether they will anoint you or denounce you as a real Christian. And then they point to a lot of verses that tell you how to be saved or born again. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must be saved just to be considered a Christian. And they point to verses about how you need to act to get to heaven. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must already have stamped your ticket to heaven just to be considered a Christian. They'll talk about receiving God's grace, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must already have received God's grace just to be considered a Christian. Now, they might feel it does, but my point is the Bible does not say these things are prerequisites. They have verses that talk about becoming children of God, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must first be a child of God just to be considered a Christian. And of course, finally, they'll talk about all different ways that you should keep God's commandments or keep Jesus's commandments, which are the same thing, basically, I guess. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that you must keep all of God's commandments just to be considered a Christian. I mean, to be clear, I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to keep them, but people sin. That's kind of the whole point of this, right? And if they sin, that means that at times they are breaking God's commandments. And if we said that you can't be a Christian if you've broken God's commandments, there would be no Christians. Of course, there are many Christians who will scream bloody murder at these contentions because they'll say, no, you have to be born again to be a Christian. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that one precedes the other, because nowhere in the Bible does it say actually what a Christian means. They'll tell you that I'm taking things out of context. And yes, it's always hilarious whenever a Christian wants to point fingers at anyone else for taking something out of context. They'll also claim that God's requirements for being a Christian are somehow clear in the text. Like if you just read the text, you'll know what it means to be a Christian. Even though the text never says any place what exactly you must do to be a Christian. And even though there's a myriad of different Christian sects and denominations that would disagree on these points. There are far too many examples of these conflicts to cover in this video, and I don't want the entire video to become a deep dive analysis of all of the interdenominational conflicts of doctrine. But as one massive clear example, I will point out the Trinity. There is not a single human being who, without outside influence, has ever picked up the Bible on his own, read it from cover to cover, and put it down with the idea of the Trinity in his head. I'm going to say that again. No human being, past or present, has ever sat down without already being influenced by his church buddies and the church leaders, etc. But no one has ever sat down, just read it fresh, and then put the book down after they got done reading and said, yes, the Trinity, I get it. First of all, because the word Trinity doesn't even appear in the text, but the Trinity was unknown to anyone at the time of Jesus, or even for a long period after his death. And I'm not here to debate the truth or not of the Trinity. I literally couldn't care less. My point is not to tell you that you should believe in the Trinity or not believe in the Trinity. Again, I don't care. My point is that there are people who dogmatically profess their Christian faith who do not believe in the Trinity. They exist. There are, of course, those who dogmatically profess their Christian faith and vehemently believe in the Trinity. Many who believe in the Trinity will tell you that non-Trinitarians are not Christians. And there are many who reject the Trinity who will tell you that Trinitarians are not Christians. Who's right? Well, the most pertinent answer may be who gives a shit. But in the context of this video, I will point out that they're all wrong. None of them are right. Meaning any group, Trinitarians, non-Trinitarians, whatever, who tries to claim that the other group are not Christians because of their aberrant beliefs is claiming an authority that they simply do not have. They are claiming the authority to define who is or is not a Christian. But Trinitarians do not have the authority to bestow the title of Christian. Non-Trinitarians do not have the authority to bestow the title of Christian. No one has that authority. Now, talking about the Trinity, this gets into questions of doctrine, right? So let's talk more about a doctrinal perspective. Dan McClellan recently did a video where he's making the same point that no one can tell you whether you're a Christian or not. For what it's worth, I had this queued up to record, but he beat me to it, I guess. And of course, he did it a lot better than I'm doing it now. And inevitably, some snotty little apologist had to piggyback off his video with what he seemed to think was a brilliant retort. And if you're familiar at all with Dan McClellan, you know that the apologist can't resist running into the buzzsaw that is Dan McClellan's scholarly knowledge of the Bible. And this particular apologist thought that he could refute Dan's point by bringing up, wait for it, the Nicene Creed. But the Nicene Creed is not and has never been a definition of what it means to be Christian. It is, as the name implies, a creed, a statement of beliefs. Do you know who these beliefs apply to? Anyone who embraces them as true. Do you know who the beliefs do not apply to? Anyone who rejects them. But in no case are the statements in the Nicene Creed indicative of who is or is not a Christian. If anyone is confused on this, they need not look no further than the very first line of the Nicene Creed's Wikipedia entry. It says, "The Nicene Creed, also called the Creed of Constantinople, is the defining statement of belief for Nicene Christianity, and in those Christian denominations that adhere to it." In other words, if you're not a follower of Nicene Christianity, or of some other Christian denomination that has actively chosen to adopt the Nicene Creed, then it has literally no bearing on you whatsoever. It's also illuminating that the Wikipedia article makes a point to state this about creeds, talking about the history of Christian creeds. It says the purpose of a creed is to provide a doctrinal statement of correct belief among Christians amid controversy. The creeds of Christianity have been drawn up at times of conflict about doctrine. Acceptance or rejection of a creed served to distinguish believers and heretics. Now, while this may seem to support those who want to equate the Nicene Creed with true Christianity, it also exposes several key flaws. First, this idea of correct belief among Christians presupposes that those making the creed have the unquestioned and ongoing authority to define correct belief among Christians. But in reality, all they're really doing is defining correct belief among their acknowledged idea of Christians. And this is spelled out in the end of the Wikipedia sentence where it says, acceptance or rejection of a creed served to distinguish believers and heretics. In other words, it's a social marker. It's a shibboleth. It's like, you meet someone on the road and you both nominally believe you're Christian, but is he a right Christian? Well, let's say the Nicene Creed, or mention the Nicene Creed. Does he know the Nicene Creed? Oh, then he's one of the good ones. He's part of my social group. But that's not the same as saying that he's not Christian. It just means that he is not accredited in your social sphere of Christianity. You see, most Christians, they fail really badly to distinguish between their church, their denomination, and their overall religion. Their church, their denomination, and their religion. They're all related, but they're not the same thing. Even if you follow a denomination that is under Nicene Christianity, they still do not have the ability to deem you to be a Christian or not. Now, they can decree that you are no longer part of Nicene Christianity, but they have no authority to exclude you from all Christianity. Again, in case it's not totally clear to you by now, no one has that authority. There is no one on earth that has the authority to say you are or are not a Christian. I mean, within the beliefs of Christianity, I'm sure God knows whether you're a Christian. I'm sure Jesus knows whether you're a Christian, but there is no person drawing breath right now on this earth who has the authority to deem you as being Christian or not. Now, if you're an elder in your church or someone else of weight in your church, it's feasible that you may be able to get someone banned from your church. But that doesn't mean that they're no longer part of the denomination, and that doesn't mean that they're no longer a Christian. If you're a very senior official within your particular denomination, it's possible that you can excommunicate someone from your denomination. But there is not a single person on the entire planet who has any authority whatsoever to ban you from Christianity. A perfect example of this is the Pope. The Pope can excommunicate you from the Catholic Church. But even the goddamn Pope has no ability and no authority whatsoever to somehow remove you from Christianity. That's because Christianity, as a whole, has no single governing body. There are numerous religious groups who are under the delusion that they speak for all Christianity. For example, the Vatican. But there's not a single one of them who can back this up with any authority other than that which they have granted to themselves. Let me give you a sports fan's perspective on this. Although the apologists and the would-be gatekeepers don't want to hear this, being a Christian is a lot like being a football fan. Football fans love to anoint people as real fans or denounce them as fake fans, even though they have no such authority to do so. Now, maybe you love the Pittsburgh Steelers. And if you do, I'm sorry, because that team sucks. But anyway, maybe you love the Pittsburgh Steelers. But years ago, you moved away from Pittsburgh and you don't get to see any of their games anymore. Now, your buddy, He's a diehard Steeler fan, and he still lives in Pittsburgh, and he has Steelers season tickets. You swear to him that you still love the Steelers, but he tells you you're not really a Steelers fan anymore. You can't really be a Steelers fan after moving away and not being able to see the games. But guess what? He doesn't get to decide who is or is not a Steelers fan, because there's no universal definition of Steelers fan, and there's no centralized authority to make that decision. Now, eventually, you buy season tickets to the Seattle Seahawks because you now live in Seattle and you'd still like to go to NFL games. Maybe you even buy a few Seahawks jerseys. And of course, your buddy has a field day with this. He swears up and down that you're not a Steelers fan. Hell, he even tells you that you never were a real Steelers fan, because a real Steelers fan would never buy Seahawks season tickets or wear a Seahawks jersey. But guess what? He doesn't get to decide who is or is not a Steelers fan, because there's no universal definition of Steelers fan, and there's no centralized authority to make that decision. This same crap plays out all the time with Christians. Except that with Christianity, it's not good-natured ribbing between sports fans. Instead, it hits something much more personal, religious beliefs, and quite often, it's hurtful. I will throw in one disclaimer here about self-policing, all right? It is possible for a group to self-police, even in the absence of a central authority. But that's really only valid when the community is tight-knit, which is the exact opposite of Christianity. Let me give you an example. I have my channel. I talk about the Bible. I talk about Christianity and atheism. I've tried to make it clear before, and I'll say it again. I am not a biblical scholar. I don't pretend to be one. I don't play one on TV. There are people on YouTube and other social platforms who know a ton more about this. I am a layperson speaking about these issues, and I have always tried to present myself as such. But if I were to start pimping myself out here as a quote-unquote biblical scholar, trying to say, look at me, I am Adam of Nola, a biblical scholar, that could probably get exposed pretty quickly. Now, there is no central authority that determines who gets to call themselves a biblical scholar and who does not. So you might say, well, nobody could call me out as being not a biblical scholar. But the community of biblical scholarship is, I think, fairly tight-knit. And the community of biblical scholars who have an active presence on social media like YouTube and TikTok and such is much smaller than that and more tight-knit. So if all of them were to hear what I'm putting out and say, that is not biblical scholarship, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, they could probably make such a proclamation and it would be pretty well received and pretty accurate. Because even though there's not a central authority defining what is or is not a biblical scholar, this is a small, tight-knit group, and they could call me out and say, dude, this dude Adam is not a biblical scholar. But Christianity cannot do that because there's more than 1 billion people all over the world that are on some level Christians, and they are splintered out amongst all these denominations and all these different worldviews and cultures and ethnic groups and all of this. And aside from presumably having some central ideas of their religion, they also have many, many things that are not in common, and they have no way to communicate amongst all of themselves as a whole. So even though I will admit that the community of biblical scholars could essentially out me and oust me as a so-called biblical scholar myself, because that's a tight-knit community, if someone wants to claim that you're not a Christian, that's never going to work, because they're never going to be able to get consensus amongst all the Christians that you're not really a Christian. So this idea of self-policing, while it may be applicable to smaller, more tight-knit groups, it has no bearing on Christianity. which is just one more reason why anyone who wants to say that you're not a Christian or that you were never a Christian, they're just being a douchebag. So my final advice for you or anyone else on this is as follows. I'm not trying to claim that you should completely forego judging anyone's Christian credentials. You wouldn't be able to do that even if you tried. It's human nature to judge people based on what you perceive to be your group's shared standards. Christians do this, Muslims do this, Hindus do this, hell, even atheists do this. As an example, I don't believe that Jordan Peterson is a Christian. Even though he claims Christianity and he's carved out a niche as a snake oil salesman selling some new age quasi-psychological undefinable brand of Christianity, I don't really think he's a Christian at all. But I'll also admit that I am not authorized to define him as a non-Christian. Neither are you. Neither is any other human on this planet. You may not want to hear this, but if he claims he's a Christian, then for all anyone else can say about it, he is. Now, you may not like him, and you may not personally feel as he's a Christian, but you have no authority whatsoever to define him or oust him from the community of Christianity. It may feel self-affirming to declare that others are not part of your tribe. But when you don't have the authority to make such declarations, you just expose yourself as a bully. And nothing defines you as more of a crass, arrogant douchebag than climbing into your ivory tower and declaring that someone else was never really a true Christian to begin with. You never had the authority to decide if someone was a Christian when they claimed to be, and you certainly don't have the authority to define who is or is not a Christian now. Thank you again for joining me on this channel, Skepticus, and on this series, Christian Fiction. I am your boy, Adam of NOLA. This channel is Skepticus. Please like, please subscribe, please put all the flaming comments down below. But no matter what you do, I hope to see you again, but whether I see you or not, just please stay skeptical.